afternoon. I'm Denise Davidson. I'm a professor in the history department here at Georgia State and director of the Humanities Research Center. I'd like to welcome you, both our in-person attendees and those of you participating over Zoom, to today's lecture by Jessica Marie Johnson, and to begin our event by expressing gratitude to our sponsors. First, I would like to thank Georgia Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities for a grant that comes out of the funds appropriated for the American Rescue Plan that is supporting all three of the lectures that we hosted this year. Second, I'd like to acknowledge generous internal support from our partners here at Georgia State, the Amos Family Foundation, the Mellon-funded Intersectionality Collective, and the Center for Studies on Africa and its Diaspora. Before turning over the podium to Tiffany Player, who will be introducing Professor Johnson, I'd like to handle a couple of small housekeeping matters. First, for those of you joining us over Zoom, you will have the opportunity to pose questions when we get to the Q&A part of today's event by typing them into Slido. And you'll see there's a URL code there. You can access that system using the QR code on your screen. Your questions will be visible to the attendees, and then I will read them for you on your behalf. Second, I'd like to remind you that today's event is being recorded and should be posted within the next few days on the Humanities Center website, which is just humanities.gsu.edu. So if you know someone who missed it, please let them know and let them know they'll be able to watch it later. Lastly, I'd like to invite our in-person attendees to a reception that will be taking place in the adjoining lobby area following the lecture. Please stick around for refreshments and conversations if you have time. As I mentioned earlier, Tiffany Player will be introducing our speaker today. Dr. Player is Assistant Professor of History here at Georgia State. She's working on a book that is titled, "What Are We Going to Do for Ourselves? African American Women and the Politics of Slavery, 1850 to 1940. Her book analyzes Black women's efforts to force a public reckoning with the material and cultural legacies of slavery. She also had an article published this year in the Journal of African American History. That article is entitled, "Justice Has a Compensation, the Ex-Slave Public in Federal Prisons, 1890 to 1935.
Thank you, Denise. I am honored to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson, Associate Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Johnson is an historian of slavery in African diaspora, an innovator in the field of digital humanities, and a consummate collaborator with those invested in recognizing the contributions of African descended people throughout the diaspora and rendering their lives legible and accessible to a wide audience. Her first book, Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2020, helped set a new standard for the studies of race, gender, slavery, and sexuality. Wicked Flesh focused on the ways in which African women and women of African descent moved through an 18th century Atlantic world dominated by a brutally exploitative transatlantic slave trade. Johnson takes readers on a rich geographical and intellectual journey to West Africa, throughout the Caribbean, and to New Orleans. By putting African descended women and the intimate and kinship ties they created at the center of her study of transatlantic slavery, Johnson opened up new threads of critical inquiry about the explicit and implicit power dynamics of the documentary archive, the falsity of strict gender binaries, and the breadth of Black women's freedom strategies. Wicked Flesh has been widely recognized as a transformational work of scholarship by the Historic New Orleans Collection, the Southern Historical Association, the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, the American Historical Society, and the American Studies Association, just to name a few of the communities of scholars that have recognized the importance of her work. Dr. Johnson has also published widely in academic journals and in public fora. And she has 2 new book projects in development. Dark Codex, which examines Black women's engagement with the history of slavery in digital and social media, and Ex-Slave, a project that troubles a binary intellectual and cultural distinction between ex-slave and the new Negro in the early 20th century. In addition to academic writing pursuits, a critical component of Dr. Johnson's intellectual vision encompasses generative collaborations with other scholars and community members. She is a co-organizer of the Queering Slavery Working Group, a digital alchemist at the Center for the Solutions to Online Violence, a co-editor of Black Code Studies, a leader of the Black Beyond Data, Computational Humanities and Social Sciences Laboratory for Black Humanities, and director of Life Code, Digital Humanities Against Enclosure. These initiatives are also just some of the ways in which Dr. Johnson is shaping knowledge and creating community. Her commitments to intellectual, creative, and social justice issues, her efforts to expand access to knowledge, and her persistent interrogation of the confines of the Western Academy models what it means to practice an ethics of history in the 21st century. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson, whose lecture today entitled Slavery, Intimate Violence, and Black Women's Resistance provides us with an opportunity to contribute to these important conversations. We are so happy to have you on our campus.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the generous introduction, Claire. But also thank you everybody for having me here. Thank you, Denise, for herding all of the cats that got me here and for setting out a really wonderful visit. It was great to meet students earlier who are thinking, I hope, about graduate school, maybe a PhD. So that was really exciting. And I know there's more to come tomorrow. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. I'm going to start with a little story about Charlotte. So in May 1751, okay. I'm gonna trust tech people. That's what they do, they're experts here. In May 1751, Charlotte asked to speak with the governor's wife. The evening hadn't gone her way. Charlotte was a mulatto slave who spent the day looking for another man, Monsieur Pierre Louis Batard. Batard was a sailor. He recently arrived from Martinique and he was captain of the ship, the Elizabeth, and he promised Charlotte that he'd be able to arrange an audience with the powers that be, specifically the wife of then Governor Vaudreuil. When Batard sent her word that the audience had been permitted, she rushed to his home to find him. Charlotte waited in his home. She waits through the early morning hours and into the evening, but that never appears. Now Charlotte was a bit stuck in this man's home and somewhat out of options because a platoon had been sent by her owner to find her, had dropped by to inspect the home in search of her, now a runaway. With the help of one of Batard's compatriots, Charlotte was able to hide for a time in the absent Meriden's bedroom, but a second investigation of the home found her out. And now she stood before the soldiers on the brink of arrest, a girl something like 17 years old and a runaway slave. Charlotte did not sort of go quietly. She was caught, but she spent time appealing to the soldiers' patience and sympathy and even their sense of greed. She insisted that she just needed to wait for Bethard to return, that a pardon from the governor's wife was coming. She asked to speak with the governor. She offered them 100 leaves, which is like, imagine $100, although obviously there'll be much more these days, if they would just leave her be. And then she appealed to their sense of empathy. She described the abuse she would suffer at her owner's hands if they apprehended her now as a fugitive. She would be whipped unmercifully. Despite it all, the soldiers arrested her. And it is important to note that they may have felt some empathy for her position, or they might have been, surprised by her creativity and making various demands. But even if they had, they would have known her owner better. Chevalier Pierre-Henri de Neville had survived the wars against the Natchez and the Chickasaw and various eruptions of violence. He was the one who had sent the platoon out to find her. Charlotte knew her owner well as well. The Chevalier was also her father. So Charlotte does not receive her freedom that day. And we come back around to Charlotte in a little bit before we leave this space. But her life helps kind of put into some context and give some teeth to the ways that intimacy, kinship, and Black freedom emerge in the space that is Louisiana Gulf Coast. Charlotte, in this moment, may have been the daughter of a woman who was born on the African continent. She was certainly barely an adult. She, in a lot of ways, was barely a girl on one direction, barely an adult on another. And it's important to think about the ways that she represented some of the crossroads of where intimate violence, but also resistance to it, emerged when we're thinking about the context of slavery and Black women's lives. She was someone who absolutely understood something about the inner workings of the colonial apparatus. She understood the kind of ways to make a claim about her own freedom and to appeal to ways of getting out of a tight situation. And she also is, in herself and in her person, also representative of the ways that intimate violence created the circumstances for her to have to find and secure some other kind of freedom. So for Charlotte, she understood her freedom as a project, perhaps another self-identified woman might understand, but as a project and as a thing that had to be fought for and a thing that had to operate in practice. The work that I'm interested in most is looking at women like this. It's looking at African women, women of African descent, who understood themselves as having rights and subjectivity that officials only designated for themselves as Europeans, with European descent, only designated to other men at best. Certainly free men of color might qualify for these. But these are women who I argue, and that I think the archive shows, interrupted and interpreted slave codes. They pursued manumission acts. They returned again and again when they felt like their rights were being circumvented. They challenged in close proximity and in legal stature the rules around themselves. And they showed up in defense of themselves and each other. They sought joy and pleasure. They gave birth and launched children. They endured the everyday toil of their lives. And they did so in a world in which the intimate violence of slavery was very, very much part and parcel of what they had to navigate. In thinking about how slavery, Black women's lives, intimate violence, how all of these things come together, I'm very interested in the ways African women African descent lived in a world that was saturated with that, and also find some spaces in the breaks for something like freedom, some other kinds of interpretation of what freedom could be, something beyond the Manumission Act. So thinking of freedom as excessive, as fugitive, as stealing a bit of sweetness for themselves, and as something that was also diasporic and archipelagic. So something that spanned geographies, spanned times and places. So I'm going to talk a little bit about today, some of the ways that I would argue that these freedoms emerge and some of the ways that we might think about how they operate. In the end, one of the things that I hope we get to and hope I end on is that one of the things that I think a lot about and I think is useful in thinking about African women and women African descent lives is that we have to think about them in diasporic terms, we have to think about them in archipelagic terms, and we can think about what we might conceive of and what they were conceiving of as Black femme freedom, as a freedom that's attuned to the epistemological dilemma familiar to people of African descent who were scattered by slavery across the Atlantic world, and a freedom that asks over and over, how did we get here? What is this place and what does it mean to live? So in thinking about the archive, I kind of wanted to sort of set out a little bit an awareness of some of the terms of debate, and like the visual archive of Black womanhood is always a really good one for this. So I'm very interested in the ways that Black women appear in ephemeral, contingent, and extraordinary ways within archives, within documents, within sources. I'm interested in the kind of defiance that they exhibit, even in the face of profound dispossession. I'm interested in their disappearance and excision from the archive where it occurs, right? So I sort of start here just for our purposes with this watercolor by Edouard Marquis from 1867, which in some ways is, you might imagine, is sort of kind of stereotypical image of Black womanhood of New Orleans. To kind of think about the ways that there are images that we have in our minds of how Black women lived and operated in the period of slavery in an earlier period, even when we are confronted with documents and sources that might say something different, contradicted, complicated. It's important to kind of think about how are we thinking about what Black womanhood is and how that might operate. Another thing to think about are the ways that that image is also building on a whole host of other images that are circulating across the Atlantic world in this time period. So this is one of the famous / infamous Casas paintings, De Español y Negra Mulato. And this particular one is picturing a man of Spanish descent, the representation of a man of Spanish descent, a representation of a woman, an African woman, or at least a woman of two African parents or two Black parents, and mulattoes. And thinking about the ways that there is a kind of lexicon of phenotype, of intimate, of sexual liaison, of reproduction that are circulating that help configure how, over time, societies, laws, slave owners, colonial officials, administrators, and others are responding to the women around them in real life. And so there's this broader archive that's getting created. So as you see, we're moving backwards in time to 1780. And the last one I wanted to leave us with is around the same time period, but across the Atlantic. So this is one of the earlier images of depicting, among other things, the Signa. This is Dominique Lamiral, and you can see the second female representing figure. What is this? From my right, from your left, is the image of the Signa. And so, and I'll talk a little bit about it in a second, but in the book, one of the things I talk about are the ways that this iconography is circulating, but it also gives us an opportunity to window into the ways that African women, free African women, enslaved African women who do not cross the Atlantic, who are part of slave-holding societies on the continent, are also part of this broader conversation that is happening on both sides. One of the scholars I think is very interesting to think with here is Lisa Z. Winters, who talks about the seigneurs. And these seigneurs are free African women, property owners, traders, commercial agents, and slave owners. The woman behind this particular woman is described in the text, in the caption. I thought I had it here, but I don't, as a negress, but is a negress esclave, is a female slave. And in that context, in the Seigneur context, we're talking about located at Saint Louis, Grey, in a Senegambian context. But you have this kind of representation, maybe not the same accoutrements like the mouchoir de tête, the dress, the umbrella, et cetera, but you have the same figure that is operating in other parts of the coast. So in this context, we're talking and thinking about Gorée and how the Seigneur figures. One of the things that Lisa Z. Winters writes and talks about is the juxtaposition of the opulent seigneur. So in this representation, that she has a servant, that she has European dress, first of all, but also the multiplication of cloths around her, the pañes. All of these are meant to signal opulence. The juxtaposition of opulent seigneur and the enslaved person in tourist documents and historical recollection, this is all part of how we understand not just the history of slavery and diaspora, but also the representation of women. So you have this same representation, which is the door, the door of no return at the House of Slaves at Gorée. All of this is all happening at the same time, even as the House of Slaves at Gorée, increasingly now, but for a long time, the history of that house was actually the history also of a seigneur and Pepin, who lived there with her family and her own enslaved people. So there's a lot of complicated layers. And I like to kind of throw this back across the Atlantic so that we see that this is not just America's side of the story situation. This is something that spans across time and space. We also might think about the ways that, what is the portal that goes from that image of the seigneur, these other images, the watercolor, the Gastas painting, to also this, to go back that door. So this is some of the work I do also in the book, and this is just for reference, some of the ways that this kind of diasporic and archipelagic context breaks down. So it begins in exactly that space of Gorée and Saint Louis. It begins thinking about free African women, thinking about the way that French and Wolof in particular context on the continent operates, and moves literally from the countryside, the Dupé, to the coast, to thinking about Gorée and Saint Louis, and then into the Traversée, the long middle passage to the Caribbean, and then ends up in Louisiana. And even the naming here becomes very important because we have, I didn't put the indigenous name for Senegal, which is Senegal, but we do have Bulbancha, which is the name that is taken up by, particularly by indigenous Gulf Coast folks now as the name of the land that now New Orleans sort of sits on. So even the names here become a way of sort of thinking about how these histories are overlapping and how these histories can be portals into thinking about how this all works on Black women's lives. So the title Wicked Flesh also really is a way to kind of activate some of our ways of thinking around these things. It obviously draws from Gordon Spiller's iconic text, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book, which many scholars are responding to. Marisa Fuentes, Riley Snorton, and others. And most recently, we also can think about, especially if we're thinking with Charlotte, can also think about age in this context as well. So lately, I've been very interested in thinking about the work, and it was especially highlighted here in an event that was organized by Christina Thomas at JHU for Taller Electric Marronage, was one of the projects that I helped co-organize and I'm kin curator of. Very interested in the work by Habiba Ibrahim, who has a recent book thinking about Black age, and that is thinking about how Spiller's work has been this kind of flashpoint for thinking about Black feminist thought, but also the ways that age can operate within this context of thinking about Black women, violence, intimacy, and more. And so Spillers also is talking about this in Mama's Baby and thinking about how in the middle passage, people are literally suspended. And we can think about that image of the door of no return in that portal. People are literally suspended in the oceanic, literally suspended. And that's part of the project of slavery. It's part of the project of empire to suspend African persons into particular kind of spaces so that they can then be commodified and used in particular ways. Ibrahim also is also thinking with that and thinking about what thinking about oceanic life actually might offer us as far as thinking about afterlives, thinking about long lives, thinking about what it might mean if we took up sort of transgressing time and space to take up Black joy, Black girl magic, elders, ancestors, and more. So there's something I think very interesting there about how that might open up new ways of thinking and new ways and new assumptions about how how knowledge is getting created, and how these women in particular are really might really be transgressing how to think about themselves and their lives. All that to say, why do those particular kinds of theorizing actually matter in this instance, right? All right, so for me, these things become important because it means that we can think of Black womanhood, wicked, licentious, free, all of those things, those first images, those first representations, as part of the rubrics of thinking about the Western Enlightenment, as premise on and creating categories of being, of humanity, and that one of those categories is the woman. And which is to say, and what are the ways that women, that category of women, that we might be able to open that up, that we might be able to think of many genders of women, that we might think of overlapping, interlocking genders and genres of women or men. And what is our duty if we think about Black women and girls and their complexities, the many layers that they've had to operate in, to actually really make that push and really do something that complicated and that creative, as complicated and creative as Charlotte was in navigating and trying to make a play for her own freedom in that particular instance. All right, so to put some of this in practice and on the ground. All right, so we have this place that is New Orleans. We have New Orleans Atlantic World. In this context, in this moment, one of the space that I'm looking at is this space, is the connection between Senegambia, the Caribbean broadly, and that place we end up all the way on the left over there is New Orleans. Across time and place, that means looking at the French context, the Spanish context, and then also African political history, African diaspora history, and a little bit of the US in this context, because I don't go that far into the 19th century, at least in the particular stories being told today. It also means looking at the ways that colonial officials and imperial authorities are grappling with how the law might be used to constrict and enclose Black life and how Black women operate within that, right? So you have slave codes, you have the 1685 Code Noir, which its original name is actually an edict for the regulation of government and the administration of police. So folks who are thinking about slavery and police and those linkages, the Code Noir is literally a police code. That's how it originally was written. And then you also have, of course, the 1724 Louisiana Code Noir, which gets created after that. These codes do a whole host of things. So just to run down a few things for those not familiar, they authorize white and free subjects to surveil Black women and children and men. They forbid gatherings. They punish reproductive sex between free men and enslaved women. And they create a whole puzzle of punishments for transgressing any of these. So getting branded with the fleur-de-lis, having your hamstrings cut, whip marks, and all of these become this kind of physical residue of slavery's surveilling project. Africans, by their very existence, and their outright resistance and transgression are defying that kind of commodification. They have their own ideas about the lives that they want to live. And they did things like gather out of sight, plot various acts of resistance, and other kinds of measures that transgress the slave codes and exceed the register. In the same years that you have the 1724 Code Noir getting created, this is in some ways some of the texture, at least from the archive, that you also have of Black life. So 1724 is the Code Noir. Around the same time, you also have these kinds of documents that are getting created. On the left is the Camp-de-Nègre. So these are essentially kind of a representation of what are supposed to be the slave quarters of the King's Plantation. King's Plantation is on the other side of the river. And you can also, I'll do a bigger shot in just a second. And is also represented in this watercolor here on the right. So at the same time that you have these representations, it's important to know a little bit of context. These are the years when actually a lot of the structure of French colonial administration in Louisiana is collapsing from the imperial side. You have the Mississippi bubble. You have an outmigration of French settlers because they have discovered that the swamps are maybe not the most pleasant place to be in. They have been lied to by boosters in France. And so, like, even as you kind of have this kind of order and this, pleasant, aesthetically pleasant image here on the right, you have the 1724 Code Noir being created. You also have a lot of uncertainty on white French side as to what to do, how to control the communities here. And so this watercolor, just so you can see the bigger picture, it's actually really long, so it's hard to have it even in the whole screen. But this watercolor sort of symbolizes, by Jean-Pierre Lassault, symbolizes the kind of, representation of labor. Even though, it's not exactly grids, it's still somewhat ordered, representation of labor in this space of the colony in this time. It's just taken from the river across town. You have Africans, I've never zoomed in, there we go. You have Africans who are cutting cypress trees, they're tending fires, they're killing snakes and alligators. They're laboring alongside Native men who are, sort of pictured in the boat rowing up river. Nowhere in here are African women. All the representations are of masculine figures. Native women also are not appearing, so it's important to mention that well. And so one of the things that I find really important in thinking about is to kind of come back around to archives is how are we finding Black women? How are we understanding where they might have lived their lives deliberately off books, where they're being erased from the archive and from various documents? And what might that actually tell us about the kind of lives they're actually living. So for example, this representation in some ways of the everyday life may have been incredibly accurate, right? So you have Africans who would have been working for various owners on either side of the river. You have Africans who would have conducted pirogues back and forth across the river between the town and the plantation, up and down the river. You have Africans who would have come down into town from the plantations on either side of the river on Sundays or on feast days. Opportunities to gather, opportunities to create other kinds of geographies. And that included gatherings like dances. Now, this is not a New Orleans image. I don't want to pretend that it is. But I have it here because the Calinda is actually one of the dances that is talked about within the documents and within the record. So this is from this one is from 1788. And so the Calinda is one of those dances that is circulating among Africans as they are finding time and space for themselves, for their own pleasure, for their own kinship and community making. The dance in its description is a dance that is performed by couples. It includes drums, sometimes a banjo. So there's also conversation about the ways that the banjo is also part of this legacy and part of this genealogy. It may or may not be related to a religious ceremony of a similar name. It also, here's an image of musicians in Calinda. This is actually from Jamaica. So it also shows the ways that you have these kind of representations and forms in different places. But it also may or may not be related to the ballet. And Cami Maddox-Winfield is somebody who's really working on some of these genealogies. So I just wanted to show a little bit because I also think it's important to bring real people into these conversations into the room, but also to show that there are actually, there are legacies that we can think about in the very real present day that are also part of these traditions and part of traditions of resistance, right? To not just see these as retentions and survivals, which in of itself is really important, but also think about the ways that these function within a broader geography and a broader field of vision in which doing this is actually a literal threat to the regime, so that laws are passed, like the Code Noir, and I'll talk about another one later, that could have you physically harmed, hamstrung. So you're not dancing anymore if you're doing hamstrung, although you might be able to shake a little bit on top. You know, like, so there's physical threat here to maintaining your cultural forms, our cultural forms. So now that we've sort of seen some of that, like real people in context, now we can look at some of the numbers. So also important to think about in the same moment where you have the Cabane de Negre, you have some years before Charlotte, you have the Code Noir. These are also the heavy moments and heavy years of the slave trade. So these are the numbers for the French ships that land in Louisiana. You can see those up to 1743. Around 1743, the trade as documented slows down until you are deeper in the 1770s. And this becomes really, really important. Why? Because you get to see trackings like this, which tells you something about some of the mortality rates on those ships, total embarked, total disembarked. Of those 23 ships that crossed, so this is marking of 23 ships, 16 carried enslaved Africans who were purchased or loaded at Gorée or Saint Louis or both. 6 arrived from Ouida, which is in the Bight of Benin. And then you had another ship that arrives from Cabinda, which is in Congo, Angola. Looking at that, you can see here is a different representation. So what I'm trying to gesture to is that there are ways of thinking about like kind of concentrations of flows of ships of Africans from places back and forth across the Atlantic, and that the Gulf Coast actually becomes a really interesting example of that. Another one just to see again that kind of clustering around Gorée, St. Louis, and the Gambia, and you also see the you see Cabinda there, and you see Ouida, which is still the British form on that side, and then again Gorée, major presence. And these are about the numbers, not the ships themselves. All right, so this would have been in some ways the kinds of community African women would have operated in. And this is what we're able to access, right? Like these are the resources we have available to us with the archive that we have. These are the ship registers that are available. And that means that we have only so much sort of documentation, and we also need to be creative about how we think about it. So this is also why to kind of come back to thinking about how do we think differently, even about how Black womanhood is situated, how age is situated, how gender is situated, in order to really push deep into some of these stories and some of these documents like Charlotte's story. All right, so an example, not a Charlotte example, another one. Suzanne. Suzanne in 1725 is described as a negress in the document. And she moves with her husband to a plot of land just above the growing town of New Orleans. She'd been enslaved to the Company of the Indies and been laboring on that plantation. She moves because her husband, Louis Congo, had recently entered into contract with the Superior Council of Louisiana, which is one of the governing bodies of Louisiana. He agrees that he would serve as a colony's executioner. Congo agrees to perform amputations, brandings, hangings, whippings. He agrees to torture and break colonial subjects in the wheel, all on behalf of the crown and colonial officials. His labor knows no racial boundaries. Anybody could submit and could be submitted to his ministry. In return, Congo is granted his freedom, land, rations, and Suzanne. You see this, you see the description here. Now, Suzanne doesn't receive her freedom. This is one of the reasons I like to bring up Suzanne a lot is, because in the document, she's not named by name. You find her name later on in actually Catholic sacramental registers, where it shows Louis Congo and his wife. But I also like to mention because the sort of story of it that he got his freedom and he got the freedom of his wife, he actually gets his use of her. So the description is he gets the full use of his wife to live with him, save when the company needs to employ her in their service. And Louis agrees to this, and he proceeds to rent his wife from the Company of Indies, because as far as officials are concerned, his request for his wife had therefore been honored and fulfilled. The other thing I like to gesture to here is that Suzanne's opinions on such matters are neither solicited nor recorded. So where Charlotte indexes a way of thinking about intimate violence is literally in some ways the product of intimate violence. There is also another way of thinking about intimate violence during slavery that is both specific and also encompasses the kind of broader pressures of use and possession that are required in order to create a slaveholding society. So Louis' demands include rights to things, right? Rights to a plot of land, rights to ration, rights to alcohol. His wife is indexed in that. And it's important to see that aspect of her existence as sa femme, as the wife, as well as her movements into maybe potentially a better, a more autonomous situation. But there's something there that I think is important to trouble. Like, what are the ways that we're thinking about her being subject to Louis Congo? Is there a way to think about that in a way that appreciates that there's something different about being subject to an enslaved man as your husband from an owner? But there's also something there that is shockingly and dangerously parallel. And what does it mean to see both of those at the same time in a way that keeps them both in our vision? The hospital. So Africans arrive on the Gulf Coast. They, like Suzanne, might be moved around in a relationship to a whole host of property exchanges, including exchanges made by enslaved men who are making place for freedom. They also might be moving themselves as well. They're cultivating ways of thinking about their time, their bodies, and their space that are going to be transgressive to colonial officials who want them to be in certain times and places to control their labor and also to control their persons. The river becomes a really interesting pivot to this. The way that, as we saw, the way that people are moving potentially up and down the river, the way that the river becomes a kind of rallying point and also a mechanism for escape into the swamps, to other plantations, to the town center, around town, around New Orleans. But you also have these other places where Africans and free Africans begin to congregate. And the hospital becomes one of those key spaces. It becomes a space where if you are appealing maybe for your freedom, you are placed there in a kind of holding pattern by the Superior Council. It becomes a place where there are people who are gathering. It becomes a place where enslaved women especially were laboring, who were doing the various linens, who were healing and working under other doctors and surgeons who were almost entirely men. But it also it's a congregation node, and becomes important in one of the other stories that that we'll tell here in just a second. The other space that becomes important is the Ursulines. I'm going to leave this up as I tell the story of Louis Son. So thinking of the hospital and the kind of space of the hospital, we can think about the ways that Black women's bodies stood at that intersection of intimate and institutional, right? They stand at the intersection of intimate and institutional attempts to enclose Black womanhood into the figure of the slave and to define what that was and what that meant, define the terms of engagement. So Louis Son and Babette become an example of ways of thinking about that. In June of 1758, Louis Son and Babette, who are both described as enslaved negresses, they go to the river near the Ursuline convent to wash linens. So this is a diagram of the Ursuline, and if you look very hard, you can see it better on that one. You can see a little bit of the actual river. That's image from like 2015, Louisiana. So Louis Son belongs to the Crown and Babette belongs to the Ursulines. And where they're washing clothes, essentially right outside and near the hospital. At that time, they're working part-time for the hospital. Louis Son's husband is actually a surgeon, a free Black surgeon at the hospital itself. So they're laboring among folks who, as I mentioned, might be in all kinds of states of half freedom, laboring at a gathering point. They're laboring because if anybody's ever tried to wash clothes, particularly bloody, stained clothes with various kinds of fluids by hand, imagine that also at a river. So it's not easy work. This is very much hard physical work. And on the day they're working together, a soldier named Pierre-Antoine Pochenet interrupts them. He's drunk and belligerent. Pochenet hassles them as they go about their work. And he even went so far as to pull Babette aside. Whatever he said to her, he was not pleased with her response. Now, witnesses will later suggest that he made sexually suggestive remarks. If so, Babette clearly rebuffed his overtures. And he, Beauchenet, did not take her refusal lightly. Louison watched as Beauchenet struck Babette in the stomach in response and began to beat her. Louison rushed to defend her companion, screaming so loud they attracted the attention of the people in the hospital, while Beauchenet continued to lash both women. And we're talking about bayonets, we're talking about the guns with the blade at the end of them. Beauchenet shreds Louison's arms and body. He pierces Louison in the collarbone and Babette in the sternum. This is all according to the record of the surgeon at the hospital. At one point, Beauchenet stops his assault of Louison long enough to tell her to get to her knees to beg his pardon. Louison does so, but Beauchenet does not stop, and he continues to cut her arms, slash her arms and her body despite her physical obedience. Now, the screaming draws the attention of everyone at the river and beyond, including at the hospital. Joseph Badon, who is a surgeon, and Baptiste, who is the Black surgeon and Louison's husband, run out of the hospital and try to stop the attack. Beauchenet is drunk. He turns on everyone who tries to stop him, who tries to defuse the fight. He even slices Baptiste's hand, the Black surgeon, before being subdued by the men and others, many of them enslaved and free Blacks who arrived in the scene, who dragged him into the hospital's yard. By the time the altercation ended, Baptiste, Louison, and Babette all found themselves in the hospital, and Beauchenet had been arrested by the officials. All three are wounded and bleeding, but neither woman was expected to live. A trial ensues. The trial collects various testimony, including testimony like this that we have here, thanks to, this is not the original testimony, obviously, that's just in manuscript form. This is a copy of the page from the Black Books, which was an abstract that was created out of that manuscript document. It's in English, so I thought it might be better to have here. So they collect a series of testimony, faced with the option of giving testimony against Beauchenet, because remember, one of these women is enslaved to the Ursulines convent, a convent of women, white women. The Reverend Mothers of the Ursulines replies they would not give testimony against Beauchenet. After all, if they could, they would like to save his life, and that they would prefer to lose their negresses rather than to do anything against charity toward their fellow men. The Ursulines largesse does not save Beauchenet. Not much longer, a few weeks later, he was ordered to be executed for the murder of Louison and Babette, who by that date had both died of their injuries. So one of the things I am interested in thinking about, and I've not done Louison and Babette's story before, outside in presentation form, because it's so intense. But one of the things I'm interested in thinking about when it comes to women and girls like Charlotte, like Suzanne, like Babette and Louison, is how we might think about how they created practices of Black feminist movements. I mentioned this in the beginning, and I want to talk a little bit about it now. So one practice that's happening here, for example, with Louison and Babette, and you can say also maybe with Charlotte, we don't have Suzanne's record, so we can't say that necessarily with Suzanne, is a practice of refusal, right? So the Code Noir and other kind of legal structures like that, but just everyday life creates this kind of livingness in which everything is meant to be overdetermined on Africans and people of African descent. There's a presumption of intimate access. There's a presumption of access to bodies and labors of everyone around them. Louison and Babette are a very good example of this. That anyone can come up to you and demand anything becomes incredibly important and part of the literal legal structure, right? So then there are ways to think about what does it mean to refuse that? And not to think like, oh, hey, yeah, I would have said no, but like to really take seriously that refusal actually means losing your life in a way that, you know, is not for the faint of heart. And refusal and backing up someone else's refusal may mean that you also lose your life on their behalf. And so there's something important, I think, there to think about how those practices of refusal, the everyday practices, offer moments, as Simone Brown is saying, of creating alternatives. And that there's an awareness of those alternatives on the part of officials who are creating laws to structure and to circumvent those. But that there's also an awareness on Black women's side that, that what they're doing is transgressive and that they're willing to do it anyway. That their claim to each other actually supersedes the claim that their owner has on them and rejects claims of their bodies or labor by capitalized regime. So in thinking through that, one of the things that I'm suggesting is that instances like Louise and Babette and Charlotte and Suzanne, for example, also offer that's an actual practice of living and enacting Black femme freedom. That those refusals, those actions, those everyday practices that seem small are actually cause huge ripple effects and are actually really significant acts if we understand in the context of that act may cause you to lose your life. If we think of the ways that Black women are also creating Black femme freedoms, they're stepping into the fray on each other's behalf, that they are raising sons brazen enough to step into fray on others' behalf, that they're troubling the position of the wife, of sa femme, la femme, that we can think about, that if we think about those actions, the actions of Charlotte, Suzanne, Suzanne's silences, what we can't know about Suzanne, the actions of Louisette and Babette, that we can see both the kind of range of totality of violence, of capital and of other things, but we can also see the kind of ways that Black femme, as Kara Keeling offers, really kind of persist in pushing into alternatives. I also want to mention Treva Ellison, who is also riffing off of Kara Keeling here. All of these are ways of thinking about how do we make sense and like really kind of rearrange that grammar of the world. And I started with Horton Spillers and thinking of the American Grammar book. I think this is what it takes us to confront. This is what it will take for us to confront intimate violence in this archive, particularly archive of slavery, but also to confront the astronomical power of the resistance to it in those kind of small acts and small refusals. Oh yeah. So in thinking about Charlotte, to kind of come back to her, because I said that I would return to her audacity. So the Gulf Coast transitions from French to Spanish. African women and women of African descent don't suddenly disappear. They don't suddenly, you know, like the everydayness of their lives doesn't necessarily change, except that some things critically do. For example, some of the legal structures open up so that you're able to secure freedom without having to go through all of the processes, all the way up to the Spirit Council, the imperial regime, et cetera, et cetera. You can potentially just sign it, your owner can potentially just sign an editorial document and with some back and forth, secure your freedom. This seems like a small thing, but structures matter. And institutions that African and people of African descent are engaging with actually do matter. And this change actually causes a shift. So Charlotte's returned to her master. She remains there to be a slave, bondsperson, for another 22 years. During that time, she has a son. She acquires some space of her own. When Spanish administration comes, and we have this new access to being able to kind of write your way into freedom, or have your owner write your way into freedom. Charlotte is not unaware of this. Because remember, she was already thinking about political structure earlier on. So in 1771, D'Urneville is compelled, we imagine, but D'Urneville takes advantage of these looser Spanish rules. He goes to a notary to register his last will and testament. In it, he grants Charlotte, finally, now Carlota, because it's the Spanish regime, her freedom for great love of them and for services. But he requires her to serve him until her death. 3 years later, Charlotte, Carlota, does end up purchasing her freedom from D'Urneville. So he's still alive, but we can imagine that he finally gave in to her demands. So he purchased her freedom outright for about 400 pesos. So going from this teenage girl who's caught in the bed of a ship captain, she ends up living another 30 years, many of them enslaved, but some of them not, into the American period. She will end up dying with a house, property in terms of a land. She will have had a son and she will have freed him. She will at least one of her own enslaved people into manumission, and she would have owned several others. So for me, like thinking about like that and ending with Carlota, Charlotte, in the transition to Carlota, helps us sort of think about some of the other ways that African women and Africans are navigating these changing circumstances, and also some of the ways we can like pinpoint and really see those moments of extreme creativity and appreciate them for what they are. So appreciate that that same girl and her audacity as a girl is also the woman who had to keep that audacity going and push and challenge her owner, and continue to be creative and learn and think through the different institutions that are around her in order to finally secure her freedom in some kind of way. And these seem like small stories, but I think actually give us a kind of roadmap for thinking about how freedom and slavery and resistance and violence are all operating together in this world. So I'll stop there.
So much. So we have time for some questions. If anyone here in the audience would like to ask the question, and also we have the Zoom audience. Can use Slido to pose questions as well. Yes, Lakita.
I just have a question on one of your first slides about the Middle Passage and coming to New Orleans. So my question was, because you tracked it over the years, you know, every ship that came in, which I thought was genius, you know, to look at the ships and to see who's coming off. But did you track the ship from the West Coast of Africa? So do you know if they stopped for any seasoning in the Caribbean, and how that impacted who was, you know, who embarked and who disembarked?
Thank you. So you have the 23 ships. This is a great question. So you have the 23 ships that come across. They all don't come straight across, right? So there's a few different stops that happen over different eras of the slave trade. In the earlier era, the ships are stopping in two different points, right? Or they're stopping at one point, but they might stop at one or the other. They're stopping either at Grenada, which becomes a refueling point, like water and supplies, especially water. So it's one of the first things you run out. When they stop at Grenada, one of the things that the lieutenant of Grenada forces ship captains to do is to trade one or two able-bodied Africans for one or two that are at Grenada. This becomes a big point of contention because French officials complain that the Grenada lieutenants are trading their ill, bad, and disorderly Africans to get them off of out of the colony, right? And so there's a kind of trade, a kind of a potential resistant thing happening there as well. And I would love for somebody to kind of do more work on who is getting traded back and forth and who ends up in other places, and like the kind of mobility and the migration. These are kind of internal migrations of Africans who are considered like the dangerous ones. You see that in large batches also when there's a enslaved insurrection in this earlier area, that officials will deport like 10, 20, even 100 Africans to different parts. And you also saw that at Gorée, there was an insurrection in 1724, and the officials there stopped it and traded all of those who were insurrectionists to Saint-Domingue, but also to Cayenne, right? So you have that as kind of a practice. They just want to kind of get the bad ones out of the way. But because that's happening, French officials and trading company investors are frustrated because they feel like they're losing potentially some funding. So they ask, there's a few years in the middle where ship captains are encouraged to go straight to Louisiana. Those are devastating years. It's too long of a journey to last your supplies, your water, or like to live in the hold that way. So those are high mortality years. So you can also see that when you start running the numbers. So that happens for a little bit. Then there's the stops that sometimes happen at Cap Français in present day Haiti, what was then Saint-Domingue. And those stops had a different issue, which was that where in Grenada, they were only trading one or two. Ship captains get to Saint-Domingue and they realize, oh, I can sell my whole ship. Because Saint-Domingue is in a moment as it continues until you have the Haitian Revolution, in which they're paying full specie for Africans who are coming off of ships. So then the company is also like, please stop paying us Saint-Domingue. So the trading company investors are constantly trying to revise and remix the instructions that they're giving in order to try and encourage what they think is kind of the optimal, capital out of their investment in ships. And in all of those cases, all of the sort of solutions end up being devastating for those in the hold, right? Either they're sold into the furnace of Saint-Domingue, which you have a life expectancy of 4 to 7 years at that time, or they're dying as a mortality rates get higher the longer you have the voyage, or they're getting traded to Grenada, which is sort of an off the beaten track as far as imperial engagement as well. So you have those are the kind of connections that we're able to see on that side. The other side of your question is knowing something about what's happening on the African, like what's happening in African politics at a given time, also actually tells us a lot about who's ending up on ships in different moments. So that there is the year that the insurrection happens at Gorée, you also have a general drought and famine that's happening. So whereas enslaved are being held, and that's devastating in any good period. Now it's devastating and there's not enough supplies for everybody, even at Gorée broadly, or even at Saint-Louis. So that leads to the insurrection. But that also tells us something about who is getting traded, what the scarcity is that is leading to other kinds of pawn ship and trade in the continent. It actually might tell us something also about what's happening on the ships. So is that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Maurice.
This is Jessica, as always. Thank you so much for this excellent research. My question is about the Haitian Revolution and the Louisiana Purchase, and how does that change the whole structure of Louisiana, particularly with the flight of Africans and the Blanc, the Petit Blanc, and all kinds of different folks. So that's one question, and then I have a follow-up question with you just afterwards. It's a cultural question that I was interested in on. So can you talk about before the Haitian Revolution and then after the Haitian Revolution, and how does that change in terms of the policies and how women are often, Black women have to survive and navigate those waters?
So an example of some of the changes, and so you have the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, essentially, right? You have a few different things that happen. It has a huge impact. Haitian Revolution has a huge impact everywhere. So in general, colonial officials, Spanish officials, in the context of Louisiana, brief bump of French folks, are very wary what they describe as nègres français, like French Negroes, essentially. They are terrified. And so where, I'd mentioned that like for the French period, so that graph, to think of the slave trade, that graph of the slave trade is only for the French period. There's another one that, I could show for the Spanish period. But the opening and closing of that slave trade is literally tied to Tacky's revolt as well, and the Haitian Revolution. So when the Haitian Revolution like breaks out, the Spanish are like, well, no, the Spanish forces on the ground are like, well, no, we're not taking any more, we're closing the slave trade, no more West Indian Negroes, no more French Negroes. That's their language around it. So you have that as an example of some of the kind of larger changes that are happening. But you also can like when you get into like the nitty gritty of African women's like even mobility and circulation in this moment, you also have that shifting in some interesting ways. The Haitian Revolution, Dessalines declares his dominion in 1804, right? So you have Dessalines, you have King Gustave, you have all of these things happening at Saint-Domingue. You also have, Napoleon invades. You also have, let me back up, you also have the migration of free, white, and people of African descent to places throughout the Caribbean, many to Jamaica, Philadelphia, New York, but also especially to Cuba, because it's right there, essentially. You gotta go to Cuba. You'll see that actually go to Puerto Rico too, for those who are interested in such things. When Napoleon invades Spain, Spain retaliates and says, well, you French people need to leave my island. And so there's an expulsion of those same refugees of the war from Cuba. And they also go all kinds of parts, some to France, some elsewhere. Many of them end up in Louisiana, in New Orleans. So there's a kind of direct infusion, indirect-ish, but still like direct enough infusion from Saint-Domingue, what is now Haiti, over to the Gulf Coast, Louisiana. The reason this becomes interesting specifically for thinking about African women, Black women's experiences, that's actually a very female migration, right? So there's a lot of free women of color who are migrating, and there's a lot of children who are migrating. And then there's a lot of white slave owners. Men are sort of the minority within that context. So that means when we're thinking about even the kind of migrations that are coming voluntarily or through free means, not through a slave trade, to Louisiana as a result of the Haitian Revolution, you're actually thinking of very femme migration. You're actually thinking of women of African descent who are having that kind of impact and influence on the city, on the town, on the region. And it's not necessarily talked about that way. Like it's often talked about as like, oh, Haiti influence, but like it's actually a lot of women who are coming in and over. So that also has an impact. I think that sometimes people say that, the impact of that kind of migration also was an impact of a free, the Jean-Paul Louis, who had particular ideas of phenotype, particular ideas of class, of caste as well, that's also came from Haiti. I think that is certainly an influence, but you had 30 years of castas right before that. So I think there's also some revision there that might happen as far as thinking about where the influence of phenotype, class, free status is happening. There's a little bit of a foundation there that's existing ahead of time by the time that group comes across.
Thank you.
Yeah, second question.
I wanted to ask about Kalinga and modern day second lines, but we can talk about that another time.
So I see we have a question from our Zoom audience. From Anna Bennett, who's a colleague of mine in the history department. Thank you for sharing your research with us. Could you speak more about how the built and/or natural environment played a role in Black women's resistance?
Thank you for that, Anna. The built environment, I think, played a really significant role. I think the story looks very different without the swamps, without the rivers. It looked, and like literally, like the Maroons who begin to like really encamp themselves in the swamps, especially in like the 1780s and 90s, that the Spanish fight a war with in order to expel them from the swamps. And there's Sarah Jessica Johnson at UChicago who's doing some really amazing work on this. they exist and subsist by, working the cypress swamps. So there's, in some ways, are protected by the lumber economy and those who are dealing in wood because they are the ones who are doing that labor. So the built environment becomes really, really critical, not just as a space to hide in, which is very important, and as a space to move through, which the waterways allow you to do, but also as a way for those who are absconding to navigate that and navigate being away. And Black women were very much part of that. They were part of subsisting, maroons in the swamps. They were very much part of moving back and forth between town and plantation. If you think of who may or may not be spared in order to do labor, who are the cooks, who are the healers, like those are going to be roles that Black women played a significant role in. And so their ability to navigate that built environment was incredibly important. There are also ways to think about the natural environment as playing a role in the pharmacology of healing, of spiritual practices. And I think that I want to make sure I mention that because we are talking about Louisiana and New Orleans. We're talking about like the legacies of Marie Laveau and other systems of belief related to Dune and other such things. And so Black women also have both a kind of symbolic role in that and also a very literal role of being participants and experts in the practices of sustaining like Black lives. So those are all things that I think, both need more work, but also give us a clue into thinking about how Black women are navigating space and surviving this time period, especially. To answer this question.
Yes.
I have a particular question. Earlier, you mentioned thinking about the many genders of women, and I'm wondering if you can speak to how Black women and girls created moments of freedom and moments of refusal when constructing their own gender identities, and if there's any research that you've seen or come across in that regard.
So one of the things that is really critical when thinking about Black women, thank you for your question. I love this question. It's one of my favorite questions. Critical in thinking about the ways that Black women, African women, I just said, really help us challenge that, is that they challenge gender norms, period, right? So the construction of woman is getting created in this time period, and it's getting created to create white women, and particularly the Ursuline woman who could say, oh no, I don't want to, I'm going to save my fellow man. Versus Louison and Babette as something different. And what that difference is gets parsed out over time. So you have the figure of the diabolical negress. You also have other instances. There's a story of another woman who is killed by her husband. And one of the rationales that her husband offers for murdering her is that, well, she wouldn't listen, like she wouldn't give me dinner when I got home, and I think she's having an affair, with somebody else, and but at the end of the day, like she had a stick between her legs, and she, and I was afraid she would kill me with it, right? So this testimony goes that this is Daka. Daka was holding a stick. And was refusing his demands as a husband. So those are also instances that I think we can think about, like how does that trouble what you are supposed to be doing, how you should comport yourself as a woman and as a wife in particular, because they're supposed to be married, and how that might really kind of shake up, what are the presumptions that are made about gender. And how is Daka challenging that? Like she's having an affair. She's refusing to give space for his need for labor or domesticity or time. She's willing to defend herself in ways that are considered not just unfeminine, but also transgressing her duties. So you have instances like that in this particular archive. In other archives, you also have other kinds of evidence. I have a colleague, Vanessa Holden, who is co-organizer with me with the Korean Slavery Working Group, who's working on two women who live together as partners, who live together as married, who are recognized as married. And then you also have other instances. Sophie White doesn't do this, but I do think that this could be really, I think I actually would read it this way and thinking of one of another figure who is identified as masculine, but is dancing, is wearing scarves, and then is taken up by the men in the kind of dance area, and is taken to authorities and said, like, no, you have to get rid of him. He's messing up the system here. He's messing up the exchange of customs and exchange of goods and all this other kind of thing. So there's ways, I think, of kind of getting at gender and circumventing gender binaries, even in this archive that is so limited, that I think we have to be more open and attuned to. That offer a kind of template for thinking about other archives that offer more. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much for sharing your work. This is really kind of a question about process and like framing as a historian of slavery and African American or African diaspora experiences. So like, how do you approach the work that you do when Black women's voices are often like erased or distorted in the archive? And then you come across like an exceptional case like Charlotte, who, although it's really, really complicated, could be framed in the context of a success story because she eventually secures her freedom. And so like, how do you, as a matter of process and framing, kind of deal with that reality of erasure and then exception in African American women's experiences or experiences across the diaspora?
So erasure and exception, great question, thank you. Erasure and exception become really important tensions, right, in this archive. But I also think that that if we're really going to take that seriously, we actually have to get into the structure of these archives as a whole, right? So the kind of information that is available in, and I'm absolutely thinking of Marisa Fuentes' work and thinking of the context of Barbados, like the kind of information that is available in the colonial archive in one place may actually not be available in the colonial archive in another place. The colonial archive in Louisiana, because of the overlapping empires, French, Spanish, and US, because of the structure that allowed for folks like free people of color, but even for enslaved people to appear within testimony, because of the kind of testimonial practices of the French and the Spanish that were rigorous, sometimes overly rigorous, like 1, 2, 3 times interviewing, interrogating witnesses, interrogating subjects. Because of all of that, like those are different structures that allow for different kind of information to come down to us. So I guess this is to say that, you know, I think there is a practice absolutely of erasure. I think Suzanne's a really good example of that. And also, for those who are doing these kind of Atlantic spaces, being really attentive to the ways that what's in one archive may not be in yours, but actually may tell you something about what is in the silences of your archive, helps us kind of open up ways of seeing erasures as instead possibilities, right? So that's one of the things I try and think through in the book around null value, right? Like, so what are the ways, instead of seeing the erasure or the missing value, the missing figure within a census register or a slave ship register as a sign of it not being there, or a sign solely of violence, what if instead we held that with a kind of pregnant pause for what other kinds of possibilities might be there, and try and, and really apply what Fuentes is arguing, that along the bias grain, to really stretch that archive open and see what is in that frame, but also like what is in other frames. And this, I think, is like, this is then us as scholars being explicitly diasporic and explicitly archipelagic, right? Like, so refusing boundaries, refusing those kind of imperial boundaries around our historiographies, but also around where we find sources, and being very, very interdisciplinary and multilingual becomes really, really important. And multilingual in the sense of like, maybe I don't know a language, but somebody else does. And so how do we collaborate? How do we understand each other's sources, realms of knowledge, that kind of thing. I think we have to do that, because the sources are not like, nobody's gonna find a new treasure trove of enslaved people, suddenly saying, slavery was bad. Like, that's never gonna happen. We have, in a lot of ways, the sources that we have available to us. Although I'm always hoping we find more. I'm really hoping that we find more ship registers, like in the sense of like, I am glad, I think that there are not more Africans coming across the Atlantic, but I also am like, are there not more? Like, where are the ships that burn? And in fact, there's one that not in the slave voyages database, which is a whole other project, way of thinking about what is missing and what is not, but in a different set of testimonies around ships and the journeys, the slave ship registers themselves. There was a ship that comes across and then like burns down in the middle of the Caribbean. And then I went into the document, it's a slave insurrection. So it's like, there's things like that, that like, there's so much that's known, but not known, or is there. And those instances, I think we'll still find more of, but we also can't let the intellectual or institutional boundaries of our field or our scholarly frame stop us from creating collaborations that we need to have in order to understand other sets of documents, other places, and also engaging other ways of thinking about those documents and those places as well. It's a whole world of knowledge happening in Brazil, and like the archives and the African diaspora in Brazil, that I think also can inform this and are not always brought in as much as they should be.
So we probably have time for one more question, if anyone has anything they'd like to ask. Oh, yes, sir. I was looking the wrong direction.
How, or if you know, or saw this at all, how is religious rhetoric employed to either subjugate or maybe challenge in these testimonials?
It's a huge question. That's the last question. Okay, so I'll give you a really practical answer, which is that we have to, one of the ways that I like to think about the Roman slaveholding societies is that enslaved people in the Roman Catholic slaveholding societies were not battling just one master, right? They didn't just have their slave owner. They also had, they were battling two. You have the master that is, of the cloth, and then you have the master that is of, the, not the carnal, the secular. They're both carnal. And that's actually a really important distinction, right? That I think those who are thinking in the English-speaking spaces don't always appreciate, that if you are enslaved, you can, with creativity, pit these two people against each other. And I think in a lot of ways, that is what Africans are able to do in navigating things like, for example, the Code Noir. So the Code Noir exists and has all of these various edicts and punishment and no gathering, et cetera, but they also included edicts which were demanded by the Roman Catholic Church and various missionaries who were in different places, that, okay, if there's a Catholic feast days and on Sundays, enslaved people are supposed to have the time off in order to, go and pray. That is not what enslaved people use the time off for. And that time off wasn't even always granted per se. It was demanded by enslaved people or demanded by missionaries who are in different spaces, including Louisiana. So that kind of like, like throwing sort of a wrench into slave owners totalizing power become actually really important fulcrums for contestation that Africans then took advantage of. So that's one practical way that this is operating. The other thing you have which is what makes this a huge question, is that this is also the era in which a lot of religious ideology, as we know it sort of in the modern religious ideology, is getting cultivated, and a lot of it is getting cultivated around the figure of the wicked negress, right? Like, so if there's a figure that begins to resonate to Jesuit officials, to Franciscan officials, et cetera, it's the savage, indigenous, native person, and it's the wicked negress. And that is getting created as part of missionaries having these interactions with slavery, and having to explain, well, how is it possible that these are people who are enslaved? And like I said, that gets into like really big discourse and enlightenment questions. And somebody who's done this amazing work, who just won the Frederick Douglass Prize, is Jennifer Morgan, and Reckoning with Slavery, and thinking about this for demography and economies and capitalism markets. But like that, the figure of the wicked negress gets created by religious officials and authorities as much as anything else. Now, Catholics in some ways respond to it by saying, well, you should go to church more. Here's a feast day. Oh, if you have godparents, maybe that will like bring you into the church better, and then you'll become, sacred or washed of sin or whatever it is. But different officials react, have their own kind of reactions to it in different ways.
Question. Well, thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful. And if you have time, you're welcome to stick around for a little while. We have some refreshments waiting for you out in the lobby area. Thank you all for being here. And thank you to everyone listening on Zoom.
Thank you.